Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. Today in the beginning of another series, we're going to be talking about care and compassion here in our Pensacola, Escambia County area. A sort of an action that we want to describe as people taking care of one another. Now, this has been a part, of course, of human society for centuries, and yet from time to time it kind of slows down and a community has to catch up. And if we look at the way Escambia County was when it was created back in 1821, we had a community of, roughly 700 or 800 people. They were individuals, and there were absolutely no government, no private organization set aside to help anyone do anything. And so people literally were their friends, their neighbors, their companions, and when an emergency came along, they set aside time and they helped one another. If a barn needed to be built, they moved next door and they did the job. When someone was sick, they brought food in from next door to help out. If someone should pass away, then of course it was almost a community effort to take care of a viewing and then a burial. That, of course, was back when all of the burials were in St. Michael's Cemetery. By the time we get into the 1830s, Pensacola had its first hospital. This is the first compassion element that I think we can describe here. However, it was not a community hospital. Rather, it was built on the naval reservation. Captain Isaac Hulse was the first commanding officer. He was a physician, and he's the one that built the hospital, which was to care primarily for naval personnel and those, of course, who worked on the naval station, those who lived in Warrington and Woolsey. But from time to time, there were people arriving here on private vessels that came to the port, and they were sick or injured. And through an arrangement with the city council, Captain Hulse agreed that the Navy hospital would take care of them, and they did. It was a nice arrangement, and they were paid, the Navy was reimbursed a small amount by the city for this. But we got to about 1845, and the traffic in the port was increasing, and the number of cases that would go to the Navy hospital was rising with it. And finally, Captain Hulse put his hand up and said, "I'm sorry, we are just overloaded out here. We can no longer take care of this sort of thing." And so the city council turned to a federal government agency which was just beginning to take care of the same sort of thing up and down the Atlantic coast, because other seaports were facing the same problem. And this was what they called maritime hospitals. Now, a maritime hospital worked like this. The federal government would rent a property, a store or something like that. And the first one that they did rent was on the corner of Palafox and Romana Street, right in the heart of the city. They rented this, and then they made a contract with a local physician to take care of any of these incoming seamen who needed care. And this was to open up in 1845. Well, they made the lease arrangement. They put the contract in force. But the people of the community raised their hand and said, "No, we don't want that downtown. This is likely to create epidemics here. Stop. We just don't want it." And so the federal government said, "Well, all right, we'll turn back on that." The Treasury Department went to the east side, and they rented a building which stood just about where the viaduct is today on 17th Avenue, where the CSX crosses over. And they rented this building and opened the Maritime Hospital there with a contract with a Dr. White. Well, the hospital had been open exactly 2 days when, under very mysterious circumstances, it burned to the ground. Of course, arson was suspected. No one was ever arrested or tried for it. But that was the end of our work with the maritime hospitals. And we had nothing of that kind, nothing other in care for persons other than a handful of private physicians who served here up until the war between the states. We have a very brief look at medical care here during those the roughly 14 months that Pensacola was involved in the war. We had on the southern side about 6,000 troops here. Most of these were young boys right off the farm, and as they came in and as the warmer summer months began, these boys who had being farm boys had little exposure to the usual childhood diseases. They came down in waves with such things as measles, whooping cough, mumps, And the poor physicians were just tried sorely because they had practically no medicines that dealt with this sort of thing. All they could do was keep these boys comfortable, keep them cool if they, as well as they could. And of course, happily, there were practically no deaths from this, but that one time early in the month of July of 61 rather, approximately 1/4 of the 6,000 men were down and unfit for duty. Well, the war came to an end, and we come into what we call the post-war period. Now, you have to sit back and think just a moment of what the time was like. The South had lost the war. Southern currency was worthless. People were coming back to try and restart their lives. Their homes here in Pensacola had not been tended to for over 3 years. You can imagine what they like. The paint was peeling. The yards were sorry. The stores had to go into operation, literally trading on barter. The county commission got its work going once again, but they had no money. And so they had to print a form of script, which they used. And so once again, it was people helping people, neighbor helping each other, one another. And this thing went on for the first couple of years that way. But by the time we got to 1871, 72, another problem was rising. By then, there was a sizable number here of men who had been in the military service for the South, and they were disabled. Even though we were now beginning the lumbering era and the fishing period, these men were just unable to work. And at the same time, we had a growing number of war widows. These were women who had been married to service people, and they were without means. And of course, at this point in time, the county commission wondered, what can we do? How are we going to help these people? And so in 1874, we have the first instance when local government took a step to try and meet the needs of care and compassion here. What they did was simple. The county put aside $20,000, and quite honestly, I'm not quite sure where they got the $20,000. It couldn't have been in script entirely, but maybe part of it was. But with that $20,000, they took county land north of the city, along what we today call Leonard Street, and they built what was called the Poor Farm. This was a large dormitory-like building which was divided into halves, half for men, half for women, and with the aid of a lot of volunteers from the community, this became a sort of dormitory for the war widows and for the disabled soldiers. Of course, the whole area around it was called a farm, a poor farm, because it was a farm. They raised vegetables. They had domestic animals there. And for the Poor Farm was the beginning of a whole series of activities which the county would continue for more than half a century. Now, that worked fine. About 2 years later, the community went through another one of the terrible yellow fever epidemics to which we were subject over time. This time, a lot of the cases were coming into the city on vessels coming out of the Caribbean. The county commission sat together and said, what in the world, how are we going to take care of this? Where will we put these poor people? And so they stepped forward. The Poor Farm is working very well. Why don't we build another building where we can house people like this and get our local physicians to help? And so they went to the doctors and said, would you help us? And they all said, yes, we will. And so at that point in time, they built a second building, very much like the first, somewhat smaller, but the same idea. And they called this the Pest House. Now, the pest house was basically what it was supposed to be, take care of contagious cases arriving here, mainly on vessels, but within the community, of course, since we had no actual hospital, the pest house also took care of some of the local cases which might arise. So that was our second venture into what we would call care of that kind. Now, bear in mind, as we move into the 1880s, the city had no firms that were similar to what we today call undertakers. This would come just a year or two later, and when that did occur, when the undertaking business began, the county and the city both went into contracts, I guess we would call them, with the first of these men, so that if you had a medically indigent patient and that person died, the undertaker would literally do the job of interring the patient in a kind of a potter's field, if you will, where the cost of the ground for burial was not a question. And so basically, it's sort of interesting to see what the kind of bartering they did. At first, the cost of burial for such a medically indigent person was about $1.50. Now, at almost exactly the same time, the county began an arrangement with what they called the county physician. The first man to be so employed was Dr. James Herron. And Dr. Herron agreed to take care of any medically indigent patients that needed service from the county, and also also as time went on and we got a little bit further into county activities, to also visit and take care of prisoners in the county jail and those men who were in the county work camps working on the roads near the city of Pensacola. So Dr. Heron went into business. He opened a little hospital of his own right down on the waterfront, and this is where he cared for such cases. He charged $1 per visit for these people, and if the case was contagious in any way, that person was charged. The county was charged $1.25 for the contagious case, and the doctor had an interesting arrangement. For some of the medically indigent patients that were under his care, if the person should die, then he also took on the idea of having a coffin built and taking care of the interment of the patient. So you can see care and compassion is moving ahead a little step at a time. Well, about this same time, 1876 to give you the exact date, the local Masonic order opened our second cemetery. This, of course, was St. John's, which is today on the west side of Pensacola at G and Belmont Street. And as they were laying out this 28-acre cemetery, the Masons took into account two elements which were rising in number within the community, recognizing that burials for people who were visiting seamen or who were infants who had been abandoned, who were orphaned, there had to be some arrangement for their proper burial. So as they laid out the cemetery, one little area to the left as one went in was set aside for orphans and unclaimed infants, and on the other side was a site set aside for the visiting military or seamen, and that is still in place with St. John's Cemetery today. So you can see as early as the 1876 and then into the 1880s, we were making progress that way. At the same time, again, I guess we would call it perhaps a compassionate area, but maybe it was simply an area of protection. About this same time, the county opened what was known as the quarantine station. Now, the quarantine station was out on Santa Rosa Island, and it was the requirement was that any vessel coming into Pensacola in a time where fever might possibly be present, that vessel had to stop and be inspected by a medical man. And if there was a question of someone being on board that had fever, the vessel was required to stay in quarantine for 3 weeks. And of course, the sick person was taken off and put into what I guess we would term a clinic. There wasn't really a hospital, but where care could be given. So the quarantine station would stay there and in operation well into the 20th century, where ultimately the operation there was sold off. Okay. We move into the 1880s, and now we begin to see something happening within the community that was fostered by the fact that people were making money. Men were in all of the new businesses, lumbering, fishing, naval stores. All of these people were making money, and as a part of that, they wanted to join what was being popularly known as a craze of that time. They wanted to join a lodge. And so basically what we saw people doing was putting together local chapters of the Knights of Pythias, the Elks Club, the Knights of Columbus, and on and on. There were a number of Woodmen of the World was still another. And of course, as the men put these organizations together, their wives and sweethearts and sisters on the other side put together what became known as sisterhoods. Now, these were organizations which were basically fraternal in nature. They were there for fellowship and enjoyment and fun, but they also had their serious side. So that by and large, as we move into the latter part of the 1880s, you see these various lodges taking on causes, if you will, to take care of this or that or the other little need within the community, and each one of them did this well. And some of them also became what we would today call insurance clubs. In other words, if a man joined the Woodmen of the World, he got a sort of life insurance policy as part of his regular paying of dues. And when he died, that life insurance policy not only paid off a small amount of money, but it also provided a headstone, which for the Woodmen of the World was unique because it was made of concrete and it looked like a tree stump. And if one walks out into St. John's Cemetery today, you will find a number of these stumps for the Woodmen. So as you can see, beginning in the years prior to the Civil War, we began our compassionate feelings, and they continued on and would continue, as we'll see in the next episode.